There are few things more hauntingly complex, more quietly devastating, than finding yourself deeply entangled in a relationship that, instead of nurturing your soul, gradually depletes your energy, corrodes your self-worth, and leaves you questioning not only your choices but your very sense of reality and identity, yet still somehow, despite everything, you remain. A toxic relationship is not always defined by screaming matches or visible scars, not always obvious in its destruction, because what makes it so dangerous is precisely how invisible the damage can be, how subtle the manipulation unfolds, and how your mind begins to adapt, normalize, and even justify the very pain that should have been your signal to run. At its core, a toxic relationship is not about the number of fights you have, the volume of someone's voice, or the dramatic highs and lows that often mark such dynamics. It is about the invisible psychological mechanisms that keep you trapped, addicted, and ultimately reshaped by a connection that should have liberated you, but instead enslaved you to a version of yourself that is shrinking by the day. To understand the psychology of toxic relationships is to understand the intersection between trauma, attachment, emotional conditioning, and the subconscious programming that was often laid down long before the toxic partner ever entered your life. Because the reason you stay is rarely about who the other person is, and more about what they awaken inside you. From the moment we are born, our understanding of love, safety, and connection is shaped by the caregivers who hold us, or fail to, by the consistency or inconsistency of affection we receive, by the way we are seen, heard, or ignored in the moments that matter. And it is in these early formative experiences that the blueprint for future relationships is etched into our nervous system. If you grew up in an environment where love was conditional, where affection came hand in hand with rejection, where your emotional needs were met sporadically, or worse, used as tools of control, then your brain, in its innocent attempt to survive, learned that love is unpredictable, painful, and something you must earn, prove, or chase. This is where the roots of toxic relationships begin to grow, not in adulthood, but in childhood, not in romance, but in the basic wiring of how your mind learned to associate suffering with connection, inconsistency with intimacy, and chaos with the normal rhythm of being loved. So when you enter a relationship later in life and find someone who treats you with warmth one day and coldness the next, who validates you just enough to keep you hoping but withholds just enough to keep you uncertain, your brain doesn't see it as a red flag. It sees it as home, as something familiar, as a pattern you once survived and therefore believe you can survive again, or worse, finally conquer. This is why many people in toxic relationships confuse emotional chaos with passion, confuse control with care, and confuse the brief highs of intermittent affection with the presence of real love, because they are not falling in love with the person in front of them, but with the feeling that replicates a wound they've carried all their life and have never fully healed. One of the most powerful forces that keeps someone stuck in a toxic relationship is the psychological mechanism of intermittent reinforcement, a ISI, term that originated in behavioral psychology, where it was discovered that the most effective way to make a subject addicted to a behavior was not by providing a reward every time, but by providing it randomly, unpredictably, in inconsistent D's in this kind of emotional landscape. You never know when you'll receive love or when you'll be punished. Never know when you'll be seen or when you'll be ignored. Never know if this time the person will be kind or cruel. And this unpredictability doesn't repel you. It bonds you deeper, because the human brain, especially one wired for trauma, becomes obsessed with trying to predict, control, and earn the next moment of peace. Over time, you begin to shrink your needs, quiet your voice, soften your expectations, not because you're weak, but because your nervous system has been slowly conditioned to accept crumbs and call it a feast, to lower your standards in exchange for even the smallest glimpse of affection, to trade authenticity for survival. You find yourself defending the very person who hurts you, justifying their behavior, repeating to friends phrases like, "It's not always like this," or "They're just going through something." And perhaps worst of all, you begin to internalize the idea that maybe it's your fault. Maybe you're too sensitive, too needy, too much. This is where gaslighting enters the scene. One of the most devastating psychological tools used in toxic relationships, where the abuser subtly and persistently distorts your sense of reality, denies your feelings, rewrites the past, and manipulates your emotional responses until you begin to question not only the relationship, but your sanity itself. The victim of gaslighting starts to doubt their instincts, mistrust their memory, and eventually hand over their emotional authority to the very person who is destabilizing them, creating a dynamic of dependence where the abuser becomes the gatekeeper of what is real and what is not, leaving the victim increasingly disoriented and unable to trust themselves. At this point, the toxic relationship is no longer just a bond. It has become a psychological prison, a place where you are no longer fighting for love, but fighting for clarity, for control, for the chance to feel sane again. And this is why simply walking away is so much harder than it seems to those on the outside. Leaving a toxic relationship is not just about packing your bags or deleting a number. It is about detaching from a psychological identity that has been constructed around pain. It is about grieving a hope that you once clung to like a lifeline. It is about facing the terrifying emptiness that exists when your sense of self has been built through someone else's validation. Many people in toxic relationships stay not because they are weak, but because the relationship has become a mirror that reflects a distorted version of who they are. And walking away means not only leaving the person, but also facing the immense work of rebuilding an identity that has been chipped away, piece by piece, for years. And then there's the illusion of change, perhaps the most seductive lie of all in a toxic dynamic. The belief that if you just love harder, wait longer, understand more deeply, or become better in some way, the other person will finally transform into the version of themselves you glimpsed at the beginning. But that version, in many cases, was a mask, a carefully constructed persona that was used to hook you in, not necessarily with malicious intent, but through deeply ingrained manipulative patterns often rooted in their own unhealed wounds. And the problem is that you fell in love with the potential, not the reality, and now that potential is the leash that keeps you hoping, waiting, sacrificing. Toxic relationships often feel like unfinished stories, emotional cliffhangers that trick the mind into believing that the next chapter will bring resolution, healing, redemption. And this false hope can be more dangerous than the pain itself, because it keeps you emotionally invested in a fantasy rather than grounded in the truth of what is actually happening. To break free from a toxic relationship is to begin a process of emotional detoxification, a slow, painful, but necessary reprogramming of your mind, your nervous system, and your belief systems, where you learn to separate love from suffering, validation from control, and connection from self-abandonment. It means learning to sit with the discomfort of loneliness, to face the silence that follows leaving someone who once occupied every emotional corner of your mind, to rebuild your sense of self without needing to be mirrored by another person's approval. It is only through this journey of emotional sobriety that you begin to realize how much of your pain was not about the other person, but about the parts of you that were already wounded and unprotected before they arrived. And once you begin to tend to those parts with compassion rather than judgment, with understanding rather than blame, the cycle begins to lose its power. You start to see the patterns that once ensnared you, not as signs of your failure, but as invitations to heal, to reparent yourself, to rewrite the script that told you love was pain and that worth was something to be earned rather than owned. The psychology of toxic relationships is not just a study of dysfunction, it is a mirror that reflects the unfinished work of the soul. A painful but profound opportunity to wake up from the illusions we've carried and to finally, courageously, begin the lifelong journey back to ourselves. And as you begin to walk away, either physically or emotionally or both, there is often an eerie silence. Not just in the outer world where the chaos used to roar, but within your inner being. As if all the noise that once drowned out your inner voice has suddenly vanished, leaving behind a raw and echoing stillness that demands to be faced. And for many, this moment is the most terrifying of all, because when the distraction of the toxic dynamic is gone, what remains is the deeper truth you had been avoiding. That the wounds that drew you into that relationship were never created by it, only awakened and amplified. This is the moment when healing becomes less about blaming the other and more about turning inward, less about seeking closure from someone who never gave you clarity, and more about learning to close the chapter for yourself, not with anger, not with vengeance, but with the quiet dignity of someone who has finally remembered their worth, even if it took years of forgetting. It is here, in this silent aftermath, that you begin to feel the emotional debris that the relationship left behind. The loss of trust, not only in others, but in your own instincts. The anxious hypervigilance that scans for danger even in safe spaces. The lingering guilt that whispers you could have done more, tried harder, held on longer. And you realize that the real healing isn't in forgetting what happened, but in learning how to carry the memory without letting it define you. Because toxic love does something insidious to the soul. It doesn't just hurt you in the moment. It rewires your emotional baseline, teaching you to equate love with tension, desire with suffering, commitment with control. And in doing so, it reshapes the lens through which you see every future connection, making peace feel boring, safety feel suspicious, and stability feel undeserved. And unless you actively work to untangle those false associations, to gently challenge those inner narratives, to relearn what love is supposed to feel like, consistent, calm, mutual, safe, you will find yourself either repeating the same cycles with new faces or unconsciously sabotaging the good that tries to enter your life. Because when your nervous system is addicted to chaos, peace feels like withdrawal. You must understand that trauma doesn't just stay in the past. It echoes into the present through the decisions you make, the people you choose, the boundaries you fail to set, and until you face that echo directly, with courage and compassion, you will continue to reenact the same emotional dramas, not because you enjoy suffering, but because you are trying, unconsciously, to resolve something that was never your fault to begin with. And so healing becomes not a destination, but a reorientation, not a sudden awakening, but a slow return to self-trust, a daily decision to believe that you are worthy of something better. Not just in theory, but in action, in who you let into your life, in what you tolerate, in the way you speak to yourself when no one else is listening. But make no mistake, healing from a toxic relationship is not linear. It comes in waves, in unexpected grief, in sudden longing for the very person who hurt you, because emotional bonds, even harmful ones, leave residue in the body, in the heart, in the chemistry of the brain, and detaching from them can feel less like freedom and more like mourning the death of a dream. Sometimes you'll cry for the good moments, even if they were rare, because the human mind clings to hope, and when that hope is severed, it feels like a part of you has died. And in many ways, it has. Because letting go of a toxic relationship also means letting go of the fantasy, the illusion, the version of the future you once held so close. And no matter how false it was, it still meant something to you. And yet, even in that grief, there is something sacred forming beneath the surface. A kind of inner rebellion, a slow rising of self that begins as a whisper and grows into a roar, reminding you that you are not here to live in emotional starvation, not here to shrink yourself for someone else's comfort. not here to perform worthiness for people who cannot see your value unless you bleed for them. The psychology of toxic relationships is a painful but profound teacher. It reveals your shadows, your blind spots, your unmet needs, and if you're willing to look at all of it without judgment, you will come to see that the real enemy was never the other person, but the part of you that believed you didn't deserve more. Because toxic relationships are never just about love gone wrong. They are about power, control, fear, abandonment, childhood wounds, and most of all, the parts of ourselves we have neglected, abandoned, or silenced in the desperate pursuit of being chosen by someone else. But the truth is, you were never meant to be chosen by someone who couldn't even choose themselves, never meant to earn affection by compromising your soul, never meant to confuse pain with purpose or control with devotion. And the moment you truly internalize that, not just intellectually but somatically, emotionally, spiritually, is the moment you begin to wake up from the trance. In the end, the psychology of toxic relationships is not just a study in dysfunction, but a call to deeper self-awareness, a painful but necessary breaking open of everything false so that something true, something whole, something unshakably yours can emerge. And when that happens, when you finally learn to sit with yourself, not in shame, not in scarcity, but in sovereignty, you begin to attract a very different kind of love. Not the dramatic, addictive highs and lows of trauma bonding, but the quiet, steady rhythm of someone who meets you where you are, who sees you without needing to fix you, and who loves you without asking you to abandon yourself in return. But more importantly, you become that person for yourself, your own witness, your own advocate, your own source of safety. And from that place, no toxic relationship can ever again convince you that suffering is the price you must pay to be loved. Because now you know better, and because now you are finally free.